Thanks, Julie. And it's really overwhelming to see everybody here, to see that Torah's alive and well. I'm Hayim Herring, an unorthodox rabbi, which is different from a non-orthodox rabbi. I love learning. I love teaching. I love teaching because I learned from other people. I hear and learn from other people things that I could never see on my own. So thank you so much. This is really, pandemic has been a horrible thing. Opening learning up to people all across the world has been one of the good things that we want to take with us in a post-vaccine world. So I have done a lot of work in the Jewish community, but on an organizational level. But what really still motivates me is Torah. And I was so excited when I spoke with Julie about teaching the book of Numbers, because even in my congregational days, I remember that it was an overlooked book. We were heading into Memorial Day. When we were just reaching the book, people would go on vacation. And I really felt that this book was as powerful as Genesis or Exodus, because it is a bridge. It's a bridge from the highs of leaving Egypt and from Matan Torah, the Jewish people receiving Torah in Exodus, to entering the land. And we're in this gray zone in the book of Bamidbar, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that we, pre-pandemic, we certainly know what it meant to be very often in a neutral zone, a gray zone, right? One of transition. If you live long enough, you will certainly experience a number of them. And things somewhat fall apart and are then reconstituted so that the Jewish people is able to take on its promise of going through the land. As Julie said, this is a 3-part session. And as I looked at the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, and Numbers, by the way, it's not an accurate translation. Bamidbar means not in the desert, because the desert is desolate, but Bamidbar means in the wilderness. It came to be called the book of Numbers because a census of the Jewish people is taken 2 times. But really, this is a wilderness period for the Jewish people collectively. And as I looked at the book again as a whole, I think it divides nicely into 3 parts. One is betrayal, the other is transition, and the 3rd part is succession. And that's why I thought that we could begin with an overview of 3 parts. So one request: if you are not clear about what I'm saying, then please, either raise your hand, probably put it in the chat would be easier, and Julie will let me know. And this is interactive, so we'll have a chance after I go over a text or 2 to really raise some questions. And, we have some sources that can address them, but there's no better source than you. So what I'd like to do now is go right to our first source. Oh, am I moving on to that? Oh, yes, okay. I would like to go on to our first source. There we go. And for those who have been to Israel before, will be in Israel at one point or have been, you may remember the logo of Israel's Ministry of Tourism. It's been updated. Those who recall earlier times, it used to be on when a guide would bring a car, there would be 2 men carrying a pole of grapes, very identifiable. I would say it's a little bit more on the modern side right now, but it's still 2 people, and that's based on Numbers, by the way, the book of Numbers in 13:23, and we're going to be taking a look at that story, not this week, but the week after. What we are going to look at today, and I will summarize some of this too, we don't need to read the whole thing, but Aaron and Miriam, who are the older siblings of Moses, do something uncharacteristic. They actually argue with him and really attack him. And their anger is unusual, and it isn't even clear what it is that they're angry about. So in the Numbers chapter 12, verses 1 through 15, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. A little context, Moses, when he was staying with his father-in-law, Jethro or Yitro, was given a wife named Zipporah, and she was called a Cushite. It's not exactly clear. It may be because the family was originally from Cush. It may be some sort of reflection on her appearance. But when we read this verse, what is it that you expect to follow? Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe because of the Cushite woman he had married. What would you think would come after that? Maybe you could put your answers in the chat. Now think about real life. If some siblings are together and a couple of siblings have a beef with one of their spouses, one of their other sibling spouses, right? What would you expect to follow? I don't like this Cushite woman because, fill in the blanks in the chat if you would. Okay, right? Good. We've got slams. Moshe would defend his wife. Not clear if Midian and Cush are the same. Yeah, you could do better. I mean, really, that's the best you could do? Yeah, she's an outsider. Too dark. Possibly. That's certainly a possibility. Oh, she isn't really like us. She'll never be like us. Great. So again, we see siblings in the Tanakh, in the Bible, that seem to have a complaint against one of their sibling spouses. And that's why for me, these are not just stories that happened some time ago. It's like, we know this happens today. But here, yeah, good. Yes, you're a leader. Moshe, you're the exemplar. Why did you marry a foreigner? I mean, couldn't you at least take another wife from among one of the Israelites? Great. So let's go back and let's get a little bit more confused before we get clear. That's kind of my MO in life. Okay. Now, look what follows in verse 2. Miriam and Aaron said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? Well, this is kind of strange. One would expect that they're going to attack some quality of Moshe's wife or some absence of a quality that they expect. And suddenly they're fighting with him over Moshe being what? What does it sound like to you that they're saying in this next sentence? If you could put it in the chat box. Moses, we don't like your wife. And by the way, has God spoken only with you? You know, like God reveals God's self to us too. So what are they saying? Yeah, right. Yeah, there are some riffraff, but you know, this is really, it's a personal complaint that they have. Yeah, he's too right. Doesn't this sound like siblings really fighting about, well, look, you're the youngest child, right? And you have asserted some privilege but you're not so special. Yeah, it sounds like jealousy. And after all, didn't Miriam save Moses? Right? Didn't Aaron, who didn't ask for this leadership role, come to Moses's rescue because Moses could not speak clearly? Why does a baby get more respect? Good. So the alleged argument against their brother seems to be that Moses has married a woman who is not befitting an outsider. But the real argument seems to be about privilege, I would say favored status, but also a relationship not with the Cushite woman, but with God. That's what it sounds like to me is going on. So, yeah. By the way, I'm kind of eyeing the chat box. I love your answers. By the way, if you have a sibling, can you just raise your hand for a moment? Yeah. Okay. So I'm really glad that my sisters are not here. I have 3 of them. By the way, I love them dear. We all, thank God, we all get along. But you know, there's a certain era in which I was raised. Are you sure we have to record this, Julie? Yeah. Okay. So in the era in which I was raised, I never had to make my bed. My sisters did. I know. They never let me forget it to this day. As I said, we love each other. I have wonderful sisters. We all get along, but never washed the dishes, never made my bed, didn't learn how to cook because my job was to vacuum. A Hoover vacuum was made of metal and very heavy at the time, and to take out the garbage. That was it. So I was 3 out of 4, but because gender roles were defined rather differently than the way I live them today, you know, like sometimes we would argue, and when they wanted to get back at me, they would put their head on my pillow, in which case I just made them change the pillowcase. So, you know, we all have these quirky kind of sibling things. We get along with each other. We love each other if we're lucky. But sometimes it feels like one sibling does not respect another or other siblings. We're going to go back to the text. Any questions, by the way? Thank you. It takes bravery to admit that. I like that. And thank you for the compliment. Yes, I'm also a grandfather, and I am 62. So anyway, yes, I really am. Just luck of the draw. Let's get back to the text. Now, what happens? Moshe does not defend himself. Moshe, one of the qualities that really defines his leadership is that he is called an anav, someone who is exceedingly humble. And very often we see Moshe, when challenged, goes into a kind of passive pose. And sometimes it serves him well, other times it does not serve him well in his leadership role. God defends Moshe, and what happens is that Miriam and Aharon and Moshe are called to the tent, that is the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. That's like when your parent says, okay, we're going to go into the room and we're going to talk together. And you know that that is never good news when that happens when you're a child. And what happens is Miriam, not Aaron, is smitten with what is mistranslated as leprosy. It's probably Hansen's disease, a skin condition. and people were isolated when they had this condition. In fact, there is right outside of Jerusalem, which I only learned about a few years ago, what used to be a former lepers colony until the early 1900s. Today, it's been turned into a kind of an artsy colony. It's really cool, but when you read about the history of it, you see this happen like not too long ago, and I'm sure it happens around in certain places in the world today. People have an unknown condition, they feel threatened, and they're put into quarantine. Oh, oops, I guess that sounds familiar, doesn't it? So we can identify with the isolation of what that must have been like. And Miriam and Aaron were leaders in their own rights. There does seem to be some rather large injustice that it was Miriam who was punished. According to the commentaries, it's because she was the one who spoke out, and therefore she received the punishment. Still doesn't feel so right, but that's, we can't really change the text. We can argue with it. And she's quarantined for 7 days. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit and move to another incident. But again, does anyone? Yes. By the way, I see that Betsy noted that there are many examples of younger siblings being the leader. Thank you for pointing that out. So I mentioned that here, sibling rivalry between Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, between Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe, it's very rare. We don't actually see the kind of sibling rivalry, at least overt sibling rivalry, that happens with previous generations. There's actually a progression. This is an outlier. This is an exception to the rule. And I think that probably it's part of another discussion, but one of the things that we watch in the book of Bereshit of Genesis is a kind of undoing of what happens in earlier generations, where sibling rivalry literally destroys families, beginning with Joseph, and then going forward, we see improved sibling relationships. And that's, really quite different very often from what we see in other kinds of Western literature or Greek literature. It's a much more optimistic view of sibling relationships, by the way. So this is really the outlier, which makes it more strange. Why does this happen? So, let's see, make sure there are no other questions before we move on. We're going to look now at what happened earlier in the book of Numbers. Just a chapter earlier, there's an interpretive principle in the Torah called smichut parshiot, which means we have to look at very often what happens before an event and what happens after. When we have a book of the Torah that's nicely divided into chapters, that's not actually the way the inherited book looks, right? It's a scroll. There are no vowels. There are no stops to it. There is no index or table of contents. So it becomes really important to ask, does anything that occurred prior shed light on what I'm reading now? And should I look ahead to see if I can infer some meaning of an event from what happens later? And this principle operates in our this incident. What happened before? We spoke about Moses as being extremely humble, right? And I want to share with you, it's just one of these beautiful texts that makes me so proud of our tradition. It's very humbling to read. Context, and we're not going to read all of this again. The Jewish people are complaining. They don't like the food. They're really tired of it. Moshe does have a tendency to take on too much responsibility, even though he has a leadership group. He has the elders, some unidentified group. He has the heads of the tribes. And yet he always forgets to distribute his leadership, not to take on every burden alone, but to share that with leaders. Important lesson for leadership today, whether it's in a family, in a volunteer organization, in a company, right? It's never good to take everything on alone. Sometimes it feels like I can do it faster, I could do it better, I can do it with less hassle, but that's not a good operating philosophy, especially today when things are complex. It takes vulnerability to be able to share, to be able to say, I need help. And that does seem to be an Achilles heel of Moshe. So here we are in chapter 11. Moshe is in, like just one of those fits because he doesn't know what to do with this people, right? Their hobby is complaining. And this time it's about food. I think the obsession that Jews have with food, like it totally goes back to our earliest stories. Somebody's making a meal, somebody's not happy with the meal, somebody wants a different kind of food. It's like Jews, food, these are two words that just always seem to go together. And that's what the people were complaining about. Moshe is overwhelmed, and God says to him, hello, you have a group of leaders out there, and in fact, I'm going to take of my ruach, my spirit, Vayiten al shivim ish hazkenim, vayikinoach aleim ruach vayitnabu v'lo yasavu. So God takes, and this is also a lovely image. There's an expression, ner le'echad, ner le'me'ah, that a candle for one can kindle another 100 candles without diminishing its own light. So we have this exquisite image right now of God taking the spirit of Moshe and just kindling this group of Shivim Zkenim. Now, it's not exactly clear that they did anything that Moshe was not already going to do, but it broke the loneliness, that pattern of loneliness, the feeling of loneliness that he was in. Now, it says that these that these elders, the Shivim Zkenim, if you take a look at the end of verse 25, it's right before the number 26 on the left-hand side. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they spoke in ecstasy, but did not continue. It's interesting, in the Hebrew, v'lo yasafu can mean either they did not continue or they did not cease. So Moshe probably still had access to this group, but it's like he forgot them later on. Now, someone, and maybe it was Yehoshua, it's an unnamed person, one of Moshe's attendants has an absolute fit because there were two unauthorized individuals, Eldad and Medad, who prophesied, even though they were not among the group of Shivim Zkenim. They were not among this group that was entitled to have either a temporary or an ongoing spirit of prophecy. Now it says in verse 27, that some sort of young man, I guess a servant, came out and told Moshe, oh my goodness, there are two unauthorized individuals who have, somehow absorbed this ecstatic state. And Yehoshua, and here he is named, said to Moshe, oh, no problem, just destroy them. What do you think of that reaction? We don't know if, the elders, I'm just looking at some of the questions. Oh, okay. So first of all, I have one comment from Joseph. It's not going to say Jews' hobby is to complain. The circumstances were frightening and life threatening. Yes, I don't mean to make like of that, to make light of that, but um, within the tribe, I would say I'm still comfortable saying that, and maybe it's because I've worked in the Jewish community 35, 40 years, we do complain. But there's a positive part to that. A complaint, a legitimate one, is a recognition that things are a certain way and they don't have to be that way. So complaining can be negative if it's destructive. It can be positive if it becomes aspirational. So I would say it's a double-edged sword, but if I offended you, Joseph, I will apologize for that. And let's see. Yeah, so kla'en can mean destroy. It can mean put them in jail. But it's not clear what it means, but what it is clear that is that Yoshua felt threatened on Moses' behalf. Was he threatened because he was the heir apparent? And what would happen if the order of, prophecy was broken? And did he feel that he would somehow be shunted aside? Unclear. I love the reaction of Moses. He says, "Vayomer lo Moshe hamekaneh tali, umi yitain kol am Adonai neviim, ki yitain Adonai et rucho alehem." And Moses said to Yehoshua, to Joshua, "Are you jealous on my account?" Now listen to this. "Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would place God's Spirit upon them." Wow, look at that. And I see a hand from Carolyn. I'm going to just, Caroline, I just want to read that again. Talk about a generous spirit. "Would that the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord put God's Spirit upon them."
Caroline's hand might be from when you asked about the siblings, but let's see.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so I have to admit I don't know the Book of Numbers very well at all, but I do sort of wonder if their reaction to these two unauthorized people was really down to, well, how is it these two got to be in a state of ecstasy? That sense of perhaps they're jealous because something that they felt was very special for them had been given to others. And I think that just shows, sort of Moses' reaction to that just showed why he was the leader, because he did have this understanding of people and their reactions and their behavior.
Yes, I think that's true. I think look, to me, this is a real life situation. It's about religious authority, right? Who is authorized, that is to say, who is appointed, right, to certain roles? On what basis do they derive their authority? And when there's a clear path of authority, a clear chain of authority, then, you may like it, you may dislike it, but at least it's predictable. What's really frightening for people, even today, and that's why there's a lot of, reactionary and anti-reactionary back and forth around everything, but religion too, is when somebody goes out of order, when somebody appears to assume authority that they're not designated to have. So I think that's what we have going on here. If I can just digress for a moment, Clubhouse is, I can't believe I'm actually talking about Clubhouse. That is even more embarrassing than my sister's making my bed. But Clubhouse, Julie, can you maybe describe it? I've been on it quite a bit.
I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, this is one of
Sorry.
these times when as a boomer, I feel like, oh, like I'm not totally irrelevant to younger people, even though I can make my smartwatch look dumb. Like sometimes I know something. So Clubhouse it's kind of like a live radio app, and anybody can create a club and invite people to join. And like anything else, you can find complete nonsense. Or I stumbled upon a group during the war between Israel and Gaza recently, where they were giving live updates, like when other news stations closed down. I have family, I have friends there, and it was really a wonderful support. This morning, between getting up and going to Minyan, I'm on it when I'm not doing something else that's really important. I can multitask. I stumbled upon a group that was called Understanding Religions from Different Perspectives. It was a really fascinating group because the way people were talking about religion, religious authority, religion as a kind of social concept where only certain people have access to texts and therefore they're knowledgeable. I finally broke in and said, I just to tell you, it's like really different in Judaism. There is no monopoly on the divine. We do not have an ecclesiastical class, right? And I would say that my Jewish learning is another radical step in the democratization of Jewish learning. It's anyone, anytime, anywhere about almost any Jewish subject. And as another tangent, my experience with my Jewish learning began almost at the beginning when I was working in another professional capacity. Edgar Bronfman of blessed memory was the visionary behind it. And I shared this with Julie, but he once said to me, I think that my greatest contribution to the Jewish world will be my Jewish learning. Because he was so proud of opening learning up to the world. And that's why it's a privilege to be here. And that's why we can see a direct line from Moses, right, and that influence of let's not limit the sense of relationship to people. Let's open it up. Everyone, as Mel said, isn't it very Jewish for everyone to have a relationship with the divine? Absolutely. And that is one of the reasons that Moshe was qualified, right, to be a leader of the Jewish people. Now, we're going to go back. First, I want to summarize. And let's see where we are right now. So we started with two siblings attacking another one, the baby, right? The older one's ganged up on the baby, the youngest, and they garbed their complaint about Moshe's relationship with the divine in Moshe's relationship with his wife. And we peeled that away and we saw that there's some jealousy around, don't we all have a divine relationship? But the way in which they attacked Moshe merited a divine punishment. Miriam seems to have instigated. Aaron is, although he's firstborn, he's got a pretty passive personality. He reacts to things, he doesn't lead. Miriam was by far, in her own right, a very strong leader. And there wouldn't be a Moses if there hadn't been a Miriam. So she's punished. You put yourself out there. Sometimes things don't work out so well. And then I took us back to the preceding chapter where we see that there was an ecstatic experience to help Moshe not feel so alone with the Shivim Kenim, 70 elders, some sort of leadership group. It's not clear exactly what they do. And there were two people who caught the spirit. And Moshe's reaction to that was one of great generosity. This is my ideal, Moshe is saying. We want everybody to feel this way. There's no monopoly. Here's where that principle of smichut parshiot, of two incidents being near each other where one sheds light indirectly on the other. All right, get ready, because we're going to solve this riddle of why did Miriam and Aaron attack Moshe allegedly about his wife when they're really talking about his relationship with God. I hope you're buckled in for this one. And here we go again. Julie, how am I doing with the sharing so far?
Doing great.
Okay, terrific. Sometimes when my kids were young, I took them to the first Austin Powers movie. And sometimes I feel like it's a character, Dr. Evil, who's just like always a little off with technology and doesn't seem to get it. So step in, Julie, if I mess something up. Okay, now I have to find a fascinating commentary that ties these this question together about what's really going on with Miriam and Aaron. So Rashi, who was a medieval commentator, this was, in other words, before Google, Rashi had this amazing memory and ability to interweave classic rabbinic commentaries from before the 1st century BCE, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, called midrash, which is interpretation of a text. My shorthand definition of a midrash is, isn't it a grain of sand that goes into an oyster that makes a pearl? Does somebody know? I can't see everybody's screen, but if you know, can you put your answer in the chat box? And Julie, can you just read the chat box?
Someone said yes. Someone else said for sure.
Okay, good. So a midrash is that grain of sand to an unclear biblical text. In other words, when the rabbis read the text, the classical rabbis, as we read text today, when something is ambiguous, that's kind of that irritant, that grain of sand comes into the text and produces the pearl that we're about to read. So if we scroll down to, if you can see my mouse, if you can see my cursor, if you could see my mouse, that would be a little bit scary. If you can see my cursor, here's what happened. Rabbi Natan, the provider of this interpretation, explained, Miriam was next to Tzipporah, Moshe's wife, when it was told to Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. So in other words, Tzipporah and Miriam, Moshe's wife and Miriam, are standing together when news comes to them that these two unauthorized individuals became prophets. And when Moshe's wife, when Tzipporah heard of this, she exclaimed, woe to the wives of these two individuals if they have anything to do with prophecy. In other words, you think it's an honor? Tzipporah is going to tell you the truth of what does it mean to be married to a prophet. And boy, does she know about that. For they will separate from their wives just as my husband is separated from me. That's how Miriam knew what she had what Zipporah, what her complaint was, and she told it to Aaron. So here's the setup. Here's what happens. By the way, how do the rabbis come to this conclusion? Yeah. So the rabbis were troubled that Aaron and Miriam would attack Moshe because that was not in their repertoire. Second, it is so unclear what their complaint is. Are they complaining about his spouse? Are they complaining about his relationship with God? How do we ever make sense of this? This midrash is an effort to try to make sense of it. And what the midrash is saying, it's very imaginative, is that no. This was not a personal attack by Aaron and Miriam against Moses. This was a rebuke to Moses that just because you have a relationship with the divine does not excuse you from curtailing your relationship with your wife. Moses, to be a real leader, to show leadership, means not to neglect your family. So when Zipporah, who happened to be standing with Miriam, heard that these two individuals have become prophets, she felt sorrow for their wives. She was afraid that they would be too busy having a relationship with God to have a relationship with anyone else, including their spouse. Let me stop there, and I'd love to hear your reaction to that explanation that ties together these two verses and also brings context by looking at the preceding chapter. We'll take a moment to stop and get your comments. Yes, I mean, look, if you were to read this midrash just in English, like, it would be, what's the opposite of enlightening? Endarkening? I'm not sure. It would not help you understand the connection between these two verses anymore. But that's okay. We're learning from each other. Oh, let's see. Yeah, so there's a tension here, not just in the text, but in real life. When we look today at the Haredi, and I don't know a better translation other than ultra-Orthodox, I'm not thrilled with that title, but we see there's sort of a value that husbands kind of leave their wives every day to devote themselves to Torah, right? There is a certain extreme love or purported love that men are supposed to have for Torah in that community, which often involves sacrificing, what we would consider family life. We also see this tension in rabbinic texts over whether individuals should devote themselves to Torah or should have Torah along with work, with avodah. So this is one of these enduring tensions, right? What does it mean to try to achieve a relationship with God? Does it mean that it must exclude many other things? Or do you find that relationship with God through relationship with others, through work? This is just an ongoing tension that we have, and it's not unique to Judaism, right? It has to do more with whether or not we have to isolate ourselves in a cave, as somebody mentioned, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that story. Do we have to be in a kind of seminary, yeshiva, monastery, or is it through that connectedness that we find God? So let me look at some other reactions. They're so great. I was going to mention that. Thank you. You can see some of that at work there. And yeah, I mean, some of the rabbis in the Talmud only came home a few times a year, but others didn't. So we've got this like ongoing tension. How do I best achieve a relationship with God? And my shorthand answer is I haven't quite figured it out, but I know our tradition emphasizes moderation and balance, or what the Rambam calls the derech ha'emsa'i, right? The middle path. Let's go back to the text again. Okay, if you see me looking over, I just want to make sure that I don't miss any comments, although Julie will be there to help, I know. So, I want to raise a question with you. I'm a little uncomfortable raising it because it only appeared to me, it only arose as I was preparing. I've thought about this before, but it was one of those, like, you know, I have my biases too. It's like, you don't overly criticize someone like Moshe. I am a rabbi, you know, I'm trained in a certain way, but part of it is to be critical. I wonder if Moshe has ambivalence with the women in his life. I wonder that because we find that Moses married Tzipporah. How did that marriage come about? When we look at other ancestors, other of the Avot, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we see that they interacted with their spouses. Sometimes these were, you know, strong negative interactions. Sometimes they were strong positive actions, but they interacted. Moshe got to Tzipporah from his father-in-law, Yitro. Excuse me while I take a drink. What was it? Was that one of those, was it Marco Rubio moments in one of those early debates where there was a Ted Cruz? So who took a drink in an early Republican debate? You'll excuse me again. So Moshe is given Tzipporah. It's part of the deal. When he runs away from Egypt to escape death from Paro, and he winds up in Midian as a shepherd to Yitro, to Jethro. Yitro, it just says, like, and Yitro gave Tzipporah to Moses as his wife. Well, Moshe, it seems, now this is my midrash. I'm just sort of building the case. By the way, midrash doesn't mean that it's what the text, in my opinion, is whatever you think it is. There has to be a textual connection to be midrash. Otherwise, it's a different form of literature. So Moshe is given, as a part of the deal of staying, you know, under the protection of Yitro, a wife. We never see him interact. On his way to Mitzrayim, when, you know, God says, okay, you're not going to be a shepherd forever. You have a job to do. Moshe is commanded to return to Egypt. He goes back with Tzipporah and his firstborn Eliezer, and something really bizarre happens. Some sort of divine being is ready to kill Moshe until Tzipporah circumcises their son, Eliezer. This is all at the beginning of the book of Exodus. And after that, they're able to resume their journey and the angel disappears. Not clear what's going on there, but I kind of read that as a very stern rebuke to Moses by God, like, you're going to be the leader of your people and you haven't remembered to fulfill the commandment of circumcision. I mean, circumcision is brit, it's covenant, it's the deepest kind of symbolic relationship that there is for a male with God. And Moshe does not fulfill that basic responsibility. Who jumps into the breach? The foreigner. She knows what she has to do. And again, there's no interaction between Moshe and Zipporah after that. What happens later on? It appears that Moshe and now his children go back to Yitro during the height of the sort of battle with Paro, and Yitro has to bring Zipporah and Moshe's children back to him. He doesn't call for them to come back. And one final thought is that when the Jews are commanded to kind of purify themselves in readiness for Matan Torah, for receiving Torah, God tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people, like men and women should separate for 2 days. Moshe adds a third day of his own accord, right? Men separate from your women. So I may be off base here, but when I look at this midrash that suggests that Aaron and Miriam were really they weren't criticizing Moshe because of his spiritual leadership per se, but they were criticizing him because as older experienced siblings, they were reminding him that spiritual leadership should not mean the sacrifice of family. So I'm going to stop here, and we've got a few minutes, and let me just quickly kind of scroll through your comments. Okay, so we have some people who disagree with me. That's fine. And yes, Moshe stood up for Zipporah at the well. That's a good point. Was it because it was a woman, or was it because it was an injustice and Moshe had zero tolerance for injustice? Or was it both? Let's see. Yeah, look, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I just want to raise this as a possibility. Yeah, and it is unfair that Miriam gets punished. There's something. Yeah, she should be rewarded. There is something in the text that is just it's unclear. Remember, unlike, let's say, the Odyssey, right, or the Iliad, where we are loaded with detail, right? We have the opposite when it comes to especially Torah. It's minimalist. We only get the information that generally that is relevant to what is happening. So for me, I would say this is a possible reading. And my homework for next time will be to contact a couple of my colleagues to see, can they point me to any other commentaries that I may have missed that address this issue? Is there modern feminist scholarship on this issue? So this is why I love teaching. Without this opportunity, I wouldn't have asked myself a question that I hadn't really pondered before very much or wanted to ponder.
Chaim, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
There was a question that came up a couple times a bit earlier in the chat of why was Moshe chosen to begin with?
Unclear. This is where we have to piece together. The same question could be asked about Abraham. We're told very little, but if we piece together a series of incidents, so we have Moshe as, I think a big one, he's an insider outsider. Born a Jew, raised in the Egyptian palace. Who else would be able to confront Pharaoh except someone who knew how the palace worked? That's one possibility. I mean, they're all possibilities. Second possibility is we know Moshe cannot stand any injustice. A third possibility is, to be a leader doesn't mean to aggrandize yourself because you have power. It means you have to look after every individual. I think that Moshe trying to look after that little, the sheep that went astray is symbolic of what a leader does. And the other thing that we know is, again, this relates to an earlier comment, Moshe could not let go of being a leader. It was his father-in-law, Yitro, who saw Moshe with a long line of people who are waiting to get his wisdom, because he personally wanted to help every individual, but that didn't work out so well. And it was Yitro who became sort of the patron saint of Jewish courts, and gave Moshe a system for setting up courts. So I think it's Moshe's love of every individual Jew. He didn't just love them in the abstract. Even though he, was upset with them, being upset is a sign of love. It's like caring about people because they haven't lived up to what they are supposed to do. So I hope that helps to answer some of it.
And there's a question, if we have time to take one more.
Sure,
Maya
you bet.
has a hand raised.
Thank you. I was just going to say that I definitely feel your tension with some of the almost anti-woman sort of stuff coming from Moshe, and I don't fully understand it. I did take a class, again, sent an email to Julie that had a lot of current feminist rabbinic commentary on some of the stuff around Miriam and how she gets punished, but like Aaron makes the calf golden, he suffers seemingly nothing, right? So it's clear, especially like when God takes Moses' hand, he puts it in his cloak, it comes out, it's white, but he's sort of the leader of the people. Like, why didn't it seem, that was what was happening to Miriam? Because she was, we know her to be a prophetess from a child, right? Like she was.
Yes.
So I don't know the answer clearly, but I definitely sense the tension.
Thank you. I thank you. It's wonderful. I could do a little more learning.
All right,
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. Sorry, did you want to conclude?
I just wanted to say thank you. This was so much fun. Please come back next week. We're going to take a look at transition. Not tradition, but transition.